under the harsh, fluorescent glow of the Innovation Hub, a space less innovative than it was simply new and expensive, I poured my soul into the Apex project. It was more than just another client deliverable. It was a crucible, a testament to what I believed I could achieve. My name is Alex, and at 28, I was a rising star at Viridian Dynamics, a global consulting firm that prided itself on cutthroat efficiency and a relentless pursuit of the next big breakthrough. 4 months, the Apex project had been my waking thought, my midnight obsession. I'd sacrificed weekends, foregone vacations, and even started to develop a strange, symbiotic relationship with the office coffee machine. The project involved designing a revolutionary AI-driven analytics platform for a major financial institution, a system that promised to redefine market prediction. The stakes were astronomically high, the pressure palpable enough to taste a metallic tang of ambition and fear. My team was small, a tight-knit unit forged in the fires of countless late nights. There was Sarah, the data wizard, whose fingers danced across keyboards with an almost supernatural grace, extracting insights from mountains of raw information. Mark, the coding genius, could translate complex algorithms into elegant, functional code faster than anyone I knew. And then there was David Thorne. He was the project manager, ostensibly my superior, though in practice, our roles often blurred. David was charismatic, smooth-talking, and possessed an uncanny ability to present other people's ideas as his own with an almost imperceptible shift in emphasis. At first, I admired his confidence, his ability to command a room. He had an aura of effortless authority, a man who seemed destined for the C-suite. He often praised my work, lavishly, in front of senior partners, which, in the competitive ecosystem of Viridian, felt like a golden ticket. He'd say things like, "Alex's insights are truly the backbone of this design," or, "We'd be lost without Alex's meticulous attention to detail on the architectural framework." I, naive and driven, interpreted these as genuine acknowledgments, not as subtle maneuvers to claim proximity to success. My dedication to the Apex project was absolute. I saw it as my magnum opus, the project that would solidify my reputation, propel me into a leadership role, and justify all the sacrifices. I was the lead architect, responsible for the entire conceptual framework, the intricate algorithms, the user interface design, and the core functionalities. I lived and breathed Apex. I remember one particularly grueling week, a sprint to meet a critical milestone. We were debugging a complex data integration module, a task that required an almost monastic focus. I slept on the office couch for 3 nights, fueled by cold pizza and lukewarm coffee, my mind a swirling vortex of code and logic. David, during this time, was largely absent, attending strategic meetings or client relationship building events. He'd sweep in periodically, offering a few encouraging words, perhaps a superficial suggestion, then vanish again. I didn't question it. His role, I reasoned, was to manage the external facade, to schmooze while we toiled. It seemed a fair division of labor at the time. My satisfaction came from the intricate beauty of the solution we were crafting, the elegant lines of code, the robust architecture. I was a builder, and this was my cathedral. The day of the final presentation arrived with the weight of 1,000 expectations. The Viridian boardroom, usually a sterile arena of corporate power plays, felt charged with an almost electric anticipation. Senior partners, the client's executive board, even a few industry analysts were present, their faces a mixture of skepticism and hope. David, impeccably dressed, stood at the head of the polished mahogany table, radiating an air of calm authority. He began the presentation, his voice a smooth baritone, weaving a narrative of innovation and groundbreaking achievement. He spoke eloquently about the vision behind Apex, the strategic brilliance of its design, the unparalleled foresight that shaped its algorithms. As he spoke, he gestured with confident sweeps, pointing to the elaborate slides, each a visual representation of my months of painstaking work. My heart swelled with a complex mixture of pride and a faint, almost imperceptible unease. He was presenting our work, yes, but the pronoun usage was subtly shifting. My team and I, he'd begin, but then transition, almost imperceptibly, to "I envisioned this module" or "my unique approach to data parsing." I sat in the corner, a silent observer, watching my creation unveiled to the world. A strange detachment began to settle over me. It was like watching a performance where the lead actor was delivering lines written by someone else, yet claiming them as his own. When the inevitable questions came, sharp and incisive, David handled them with practiced ease, his answers often echoing the very explanations I had given him in our countless preparatory meetings. He articulated the complex technical details, the intricate logic, the groundbreaking methodologies, all of which I had spent months perfecting. He never once paused, never faltered, never turned to me for corroboration or clarification. It was as if the entire intellectual property, the very genesis of the Apex project, had sprung fully formed from his own mind. A cold dread began to creep into my stomach, a sensation of something precious being quietly, methodically, stolen right before my eyes. The applause at the end was thunderous, a resounding affirmation of success. David basked in it, a triumphant smile gracing his lips. He was the maestro, the visionary, the architect of this triumph. I felt a chill, despite the warmth of the room. The seeds of doubt, tiny and insidious, had been planted. I told myself it was just the stress, the exhaustion, the culmination of months of intense labor playing tricks on my mind. But the feeling lingered, a subtle, disquieting hum beneath the surface of my professional satisfaction. It was the first tremor of an earthquake I didn't yet comprehend. The afterglow of the Apex project presentation was a blinding, suffocating light. David, the undisputed star, was mobbed. Senior partners clapped him on the back, murmuring accolades about his visionary leadership and unparalleled strategic acumen. Clients, their faces alight with newfound confidence, shook his hand vigorously, already envisioning the future he had so eloquently painted for them. I watched from the periphery, a ghost at my own feast. My colleagues, Sarah and Mark, offered quiet congratulations, their eyes holding a shared understanding, a subtle acknowledgement of the unsaid. We knew who had built the engine, even if David was now driving the parade float. But knowing wasn't enough. It never is, in the cutthroat arena of corporate ambition. The true gut punch arrived 3 days later, in the form of a company-wide email, a digital testament to David Thorne's ascendancy. Subject line: Viridian Dynamics celebrates Apex project success, a new benchmark in innovation. My heart, still buoyed by the project's technical triumph, sank with each word. The email, penned by a senior executive, lauded David as the mastermind behind the Apex platform, the principal architect of its groundbreaking design, and the driving force behind its successful implementation. My name, Alex, was relegated to a single, generic sentence buried deep within the third paragraph, lumped in with the dedicated team members who supported Mr. Thorne's brilliant leadership. Supported. The word felt like a physical blow, a dismissive flick of the wrist that erased months of relentless effort, sleepless nights, and the very intellectual property that was the backbone of the entire system. I reread it, my eyes scanning for any nuance, any hidden acknowledgement, but there was none. Just the stark, unvarnished truth. My credit had been systematically, brazenly stolen. A cold, creeping dread gave way to a white-hot surge of disbelief. This wasn't just a slight, it was an erasure. It was as if I had spent a year meticulously constructing a magnificent cathedral, only for someone else to step forward at its completion, claim to have laid every stone, designed every arch, and then graciously mention that a few helpers had been around. The injustice of it was a bitter taste in my mouth, metallic and acrid. I felt a profound sense of violation, as though something intrinsically mine had been ripped away and rebranded. My mind reeled, replaying every conversation with David, every instance of his effusive praise, every time he'd asked me to walk him through a complex module. Was it all a meticulously orchestrated charade? Had he been gathering information, not to understand, but to absorb and regurgitate as his own? The thought was sickening. The corporate environment at Viridian, I realized with chilling clarity, was not just conducive to such acts, it implicitly encouraged them. The firm thrived on showcasing stars, on presenting a singular, charismatic face to clients. Individual contributions, particularly those from the trenches, were often subsumed into the narrative of a singular leader's genius. It was a culture that valued visible results and eloquent self-promotion over quiet, meticulous innovation. David Thorne, with his polished demeanor and effortless charm, was the embodiment of Viridian's ideal leader. He knew how to play the game, how to navigate the intricate web of corporate politics, how to position himself for maximum visibility. I, on the other hand, had been so engrossed in the technical challenge, so focused on the purity of the solution, that I had failed to see the predatory currents swirling beneath the surface. I was a builder, not a politician, and I had been outmaneuvered. My initial instinct was to rage, to confront David, to march into HR, to demand rectification. The words formed on my tongue, sharp and venomous. Asterisk, how dare you? How could you? Asterisk, but then a wave of paralyzing fear washed over me. What would I say? He stole my credit? How would I prove it? The email was official company communication. David had the backing of senior management. My evidence was largely anecdotal, countless hours spent coding, designing, debugging, detailed notes, but all of it filtered through the lens of a team effort. David could easily dismiss my claims as bitterness, as a junior employee's jealousy. He was already ascending. I was still just Alex, a dedicated team member. The power imbalance was stark, a chasm I couldn't hope to bridge alone. I watched David in the following days, a new, unsettling clarity in my gaze. He moved through the office with an even greater swagger, his smile broader, his voice resonating with an almost unbearable self-satisfaction. He would occasionally nod to me, a casual, almost dismissive gesture, as if acknowledging a minor subordinate. Once, he even approached my desk, ostensibly to check in. "Great work on Apex, Alex," he said, his tone patronizingly warm. "Couldn't have done it without the entire team pulling together. Your contributions, while foundational, were truly invaluable in supporting my overall vision." He emphasized my overall vision, his eyes gleaming with a self-congratulatory light, leaving no room for misinterpretation. It was a subtle, final twist of the knife. He wasn't just taking credit, he was actively diminishing my role to reinforce his own fabricated narrative. The betrayal was complete. My professional dedication had been rewarded with humiliation. The frustration festered, slowly solidifying into something cold and hard, a resolve born of profound injustice. I knew then that this wasn't just about a project anymore. This was personal, and David Thorne would eventually pay. The humiliation was a live coal in my gut, burning steadily, refusing to be extinguished. Every congratulatory remark directed at David felt like a fresh insult, every company-wide email extolling his genius, a twist of the knife. I found myself replaying every interaction, every casual conversation, searching for clues I had missed, for the subtle tells of a predator at work. The more I looked, the more I saw David's carefully constructed facade, his effortless charm, his ability to speak in vague, high-level terms that sounded profound but lacked substance, his talent for presenting other people's detailed work as the logical outcome of his vision. He was a master of corporate theater, and I, a naive technician, had been an unwitting player in his carefully crafted drama. My initial surge of righteous anger had, over days and weeks, congealed into a cold, calculated resolve. Confrontation was futile, I knew that now. It would be a messy, public accusation against a man who was, in the eyes of the firm, a golden boy. I would be branded as bitter, a malcontent, and my career at Viridian would be effectively over. No, a direct assault was not the path. But inaction was not an option either. The idea of letting David Thorne simply get away with it, to continue his ascent on the back of my stolen labor, was intolerable. It gnawed at me, consuming my thoughts even outside of work. Sleep became a luxury, often interrupted by vivid nightmares of David presenting my work, his face a triumphant sneer. I began to observe David with a new intensity, a quiet, almost scientific curiosity. I watched how he interacted with others, how he navigated meetings, how he built his network. He was a chameleon, adapting his persona to suit his audience. With senior partners, he was deferential but confident, speaking their language of profit margins and strategic growth. With junior staff, he was avuncular, offering platitudes and vague promises of future opportunities. He was a master manipulator, and I, in my innocence, had been his most valuable pawn. My professional pride, once a source of immense satisfaction, now felt like a gaping wound. The joy I once derived from solving complex problems, from building elegant systems, was overshadowed by the bitter taste of betrayal. The corporate environment at Veridian, once a stimulating challenge, now felt like a hostile jungle. The innovation hub became a cage, the fluorescent lights a constant reminder of my entrapment. I saw the true nature of the meritocracy they espoused. It was a meritocracy of presentation, of self-promotion, not of genuine contribution. Those who could spin the most compelling narrative, who could charm the right people, who could take credit most effectively, were the ones who truly advanced. It was a disheartening realization, one that chipped away at my idealistic view of professional life. I had believed that hard work, talent, and demonstrable results were enough. I was wrong. My interactions with Sarah and Mark became a silent communion of understanding. We didn't need to speak explicitly about David. A shared glance, a subtle sigh, a knowing nod, these were our acknowledgments of the injustice. They, too, had poured their expertise into Apex, and while David's theft of their credit was less direct than his appropriation of mine, it was still a diminishment, a relegation to the footnotes of his narrative. We were the unsung heroes, the real architects, forced to watch as another claimed our glory. This shared experience forged a quiet bond between us, a silent alliance. We were victims of the same corporate charade, and in that shared victimhood, there was a strange, nascent strength. I also began to meticulously document everything, not with the intent of immediate confrontation, but with a long-term strategy in mind. I started saving every email, every internal memo, every version of every document related to the Apex project. I kept a detailed personal log, noting dates, times, and specific contributions. I even started to surreptitiously record snippets of meetings where David would subtly imply or outright state that certain ideas were his, ideas that I knew originated from my own work. It was a painstaking, almost obsessive process, but I felt compelled to do it. It was my way of reclaiming some semblance of control, of building an arsenal of truth in a world of manufactured narratives. I knew that one day, this documentation would be my shield, and perhaps, my sword. The psychological toll was immense. My energy, once boundless, was now drained by the constant vigilance, the simmering resentment. I found myself becoming more cynical, more guarded. The trust one once freely gave was now withheld, replaced by a cautious skepticism. My passion for my work, once a vibrant flame, flickered, threatened by the cold winds of disillusionment. But beneath the weariness, a new resolve hardened. This wasn't just about my career anymore, it was about justice. It was about proving that integrity, even in a corrupt environment, still mattered. David Thorne had taken my credit, but he hadn't taken my spirit, not entirely. He had, instead, inadvertently ignited a quiet fire within me, a slow-burning desire for vindication. I knew this would be a long game, a marathon, not a sprint. But I was ready to run it, no matter how many years it took. The wait would be agonizing, but the eventual satisfaction, I believed, would be profound. I just had to be patient, meticulous, and wait for the perfect moment. The seeds of karma had been sown, and I would be there to witness the harvest. The months following the Apex project's triumph, David Thorne's triumph, were a strange purgatory. I continued my work at Veridian, but the joy had evaporated, replaced by a hollow sense of obligation. My enthusiasm, once a vibrant force, was now a carefully constructed facade. I continued to deliver high-quality work, not out of passion, but out of a grim determination to maintain my professional standing while I plotted my long game. Every line of code I wrote, every presentation I prepared, was a silent act of defiance, a quiet assertion of my true capabilities, even as David continued to bask in the reflected glory of my past achievements. He was now being groomed for a more senior role, his brilliance in the Apex project cited as a prime example of his leadership potential. The irony was a bitter pill I swallowed daily. I maintained my meticulous documentation, a clandestine archive of David's corporate transgressions. Emails, meeting notes, subtle shifts in project narratives, every piece of evidence was carefully cataloged, time-stamped, and backed up. I even started to subtly cross-reference his claims against actual project timelines and resource allocations, revealing the gaping holes in his self-aggrandizing narratives. This wasn't just about my stolen credit anymore. It was about exposing a pattern of deception, a systemic abuse of trust. My frustration had morphed into a cold, analytical precision. I was no longer an emotional victim. I was a meticulous investigator, building a case brick by painstaking brick. David, meanwhile, continued his ascent, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing in my mind. He was promoted to senior project director within 6 months, a direct result of the Apex project's perceived success. He moved into a corner office, his laughter echoing a little too loudly down the hallway. He became more confident, more arrogant, his ego inflated by the constant praise. He started to delegate more, pushing even more of his responsibilities onto his team, while still taking credit for their output. He developed a habit of dropping by my desk, not to discuss work, but to offer unsolicited advice, or to casually mention his latest corporate triumph, always with a condescending smile. "Remember, Alex," he'd say, leaning against my cubicle wall, "it's not just about the technical prowess. It's about the narrative, the story you tell." He'd wink, as if sharing a profound secret, completely unaware that he was simply illuminating his own modus operandi. The psychological impact of working under such conditions was profound. I felt a constant tension, a low hum of resentment beneath the surface of my professional demeanor. My interactions with colleagues became more guarded. I trusted fewer people, always scanning for hidden agendas, for the subtle signs of manipulation. The vibrant, optimistic young professional I once was began to recede, replaced by a more cynical, cautious individual. I started to question the very foundations of corporate success, seeing it less as a reward for merit and more as a game of smoke and mirrors, where perception trumped reality. This disillusionment, while painful, also sharpened my focus. It taught me patience, observation, and the importance of playing the long game. Sarah and Mark, my silent allies, also felt the shift. We would occasionally meet for coffee outside the office, our conversations laced with unspoken grievances. We would discuss project details, but the subtext was always David. "Did you see his presentation on the new client pitch?" Sarah would ask, her voice carefully neutral. "He used your data models, Alex, almost verbatim." Mark would nod, his jaw tight. "And he called them Thorne's predictive analytics framework." The audacity! These small, shared moments of recognition were vital. They validated my experience, reminding me that I wasn't alone in seeing through David's charade. They provided a small but crucial reservoir of solidarity in an otherwise isolating environment. I started to strategically network outside of Viridian. I attended industry conferences, not just to learn, but to connect with people who valued genuine innovation and ethical conduct. I presented papers on my own time, carefully crafting them to highlight my individual contributions without directly implicating David. I built a reputation independent of Viridian's internal narrative, a quiet counter-narrative to David's bombastic self-promotion. This was a slow burn, a gradual cultivation of an external professional identity that would, I hoped, one day provide me with the leverage I needed. I knew that leaving Viridian prematurely would be a mistake. It would allow David to fully cement his false narrative without any lingering challenge. I had to stay, to endure, to watch, and to wait. The years passed, marked by promotions for David, by new projects, and by my continued, quiet accumulation of evidence. David's reputation within Viridian grew, fueled by his ability to consistently deliver successful projects, often by leveraging the uncredited work of others. He became a fixture in executive meetings, a voice of authority, a man seemingly destined for the very top. He even started mentoring junior employees, dispensing platitudes about integrity and hard work, a grotesque parody of the values he so clearly lacked. Each instance of his hypocrisy fueled my resolve. The fire of injustice, far from dying down, was stoked by every new slight, every unearned accolade. I was no longer just seeking vindication, I was seeking a reckoning. The universe, I believed, had a way of balancing the scales. And I was prepared to wait, however long it took, for karma to collect its due. The game was still on and I was playing for keeps. 10 years. A decade. The passage of time felt both agonizingly slow and startlingly swift. Viridian dynamics had changed, evolving with the relentless march of technology and corporate restructuring. New faces appeared, old ones vanished. The innovation hub had been renovated twice, each iteration more sleek and impersonal than the last. But one constant remained: David Thorne's seemingly unstoppable ascent. He was now an executive vice president, his name synonymous with innovation within the firm. He oversaw entire divisions, commanded significant budgets, and was frequently featured in company promotional materials, his polished smile gracing the cover of internal newsletters. His office, once merely a corner space, now occupied an entire wing, a testament to his perceived power. My own career had progressed steadily, if less spectacularly. I was a principal architect, a respected technical leader, sought after for my expertise on complex projects. My reputation, built on consistent delivery and genuine problem-solving, was solid. I had cultivated a network of allies, both inside and outside Viridian, who knew my capabilities and respected my integrity. Many, particularly those who had worked closely with David on various projects, shared a quiet, unspoken understanding of his true nature. They saw the pattern, the subtle yet undeniable way he absorbed the achievements of others, repackaging them as his own. But in a corporate culture that rewarded outward success above all else, their understanding remained largely private, a collective shrug of resignation. My archive of David's transgressions had grown into a formidable dossier. It wasn't just the Apex project anymore. Over the years, I had meticulously documented similar instances of credit theft, of ideas appropriated, of successful initiatives spun as his sole brainchild, while the true innovators were relegated to the shadows. I had emails, project plans, meeting minutes, performance reviews, even public-facing articles where David claimed intellectual property that was demonstrably not his. It was a comprehensive, undeniable chronicle of a career built on deceit. The sheer volume of evidence, gathered patiently over a decade, was staggering. It wasn't just about proving my case, it was about exposing a systemic pattern of behavior. David, in his elevated position, had grown bolder, more careless. The higher he climbed, the more insulated he seemed to become from accountability. He had developed an almost imperial air, rarely interacting with anyone below his direct reports, and even then his conversations were brief, often dismissive. He was a man who believed his own hype, completely convinced of his own genius. He had even started to take on external roles, speaking at industry conferences, publishing articles under his name, and even serving on the board of a tech startup. His public persona was that of a visionary leader, a titan of industry. The irony was almost unbearable. The psychological toll of maintaining this long-term vigilance was immense. There were days I felt utterly drained, the weight of the injustice almost crushing. The cynicism, once a new and unsettling emotion, had become a default setting. I had learned to compartmentalize, to separate my true feelings from my professional interactions. It was a survival mechanism, but it came at a cost. I often felt a deep-seated weariness, a sense of having aged beyond my years. But beneath the weariness, the fire of vindication still burned. It was a colder flame now, less about anger and more about a profound belief in justice, a conviction that truth, eventually, would prevail. Then came the news, a ripple that quickly turned into a wave throughout Viridian. David Thorne was being considered for the Chief Technology Officer position, CTO. It was the pinnacle, the ultimate validation of his fabricated career. The announcement sent a jolt through me, a mixture of dread and a grim satisfaction. This was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for. This was the point of no return. If he achieved this, his power would be virtually unassailable. My window of opportunity was closing, rapidly. The thought of him, a fraud, occupying such a critical, influential role, was an anathema. It would not only be a personal affront but a betrayal of the very principles of innovation and integrity I held dear. The firm began a rigorous vetting process for the CTO role, a standard procedure for such a high-level appointment. It involved extensive background checks, interviews with past and present colleagues, and a deep dive into candidates' professional histories. This was my opening. Not a direct confrontation, not a messy accusation, but a quiet, strategic intervention. I needed to ensure my information reached the right people, the people who were genuinely interested in the integrity of the firm, not just its public image. I had spent a decade preparing for this. Every saved email, every documented conversation, every subtle observation, it all led to this moment. The internal discussions about David's candidacy were already buzzing. Some were genuinely excited, blinded by his charisma and the narrative of his success. Others, like me, harbored deep reservations, a quiet unease that something was fundamentally wrong. I began to subtly, almost imperceptibly, plant seeds of doubt. Not accusations, but questions. You know, it's fascinating how David managed to oversee so many critical projects simultaneously, I'd casually remark to a trusted colleague in a different department. He must have an incredible knack for delegation, given how much of the foundational work was done by others. Or, his ability to distill complex technical concepts into simple business narratives is truly unique. I often wonder how he manages to grasp the intricacies so quickly, given his focus on the higher-level strategy. These were not direct accusations, but rather subtle invitations for people to look closer, to question the narrative they had been fed. The stage was set. The decade-long wait was almost over. The final act of corporate karma was about to begin. The whispers about David Thorne's CTO candidacy grew louder, a low hum of anticipation and speculation throughout Viridian. My carefully planted seeds of doubt began to sprout, not into outright accusations, but into a subtle undercurrent of questioning. People, prompted by my seemingly innocuous remarks, started to look at David's track record with a slightly more critical eye. They began to notice the pattern, the consistent success, yes, but also the consistent lack of detailed technical understanding on his part, the way he always seemed to present the work of others as a natural extension of his vision. It was a slow drip of realization, eroding the carefully constructed facade of his genius. My strategy was precise. I wouldn't be the accuser. I would be the facilitator of truth. I knew that a direct, emotional confrontation from me would be easily dismissed as personal vendetta. Instead, I needed the evidence to speak for itself, to be discovered organically by those whose job it was to vet him. The internal vetting process for the CTO role was rigorous, involving deep dives into professional history, interviews with current and former colleagues, and an analysis of past project contributions. This was my window. I needed to ensure my meticulously compiled dossier found its way into the hands of the right people without appearing to be a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. My first move was subtle. I reached out to a former colleague, someone I deeply respected, who had recently moved into the internal audit department. This individual, Michael, was known for his integrity and his meticulous attention to detail. We met for coffee outside the office, a seemingly casual catch-up. Our conversation drifted, as it always did, to the challenges of corporate life, the pressures, the politics. I casually mentioned the upcoming CTO selection process and, with a feigned sigh, mused, "It's such a critical role, isn't it? So much rides on getting the right person. You really need someone with a rock-solid, demonstrable track record of technical innovation, not just high-level management. Someone who truly understands the nuts and bolts, who can lead from a place of deep expertise." I paused, letting the implication hang in the air. I just hope they do their due diligence thoroughly. Some of David's past projects, while successful, had interesting dynamics in terms of credit allocation. I left it at that, a breadcrumb, not a trail. Michael's eyes, sharp and intelligent, met mine. He simply nodded, a flicker of understanding passing between us. He didn't ask for specifics, and I didn't offer any. The seed was planted. Next, I subtly began to share certain historical project documents with key individuals who would be involved in the CTO vetting process, always under the guise of knowledge sharing or providing context for current initiatives. For instance, I might send an old project charter from the Apex project to a senior manager on the vetting committee, ostensibly to show how a particular module evolved. But within that charter, buried deep in an appendix, would be an early design document clearly attributed to me, which David had later presented as his own groundbreaking concept. I didn't highlight these discrepancies. I simply made the information available, trusting that intelligent people, when presented with conflicting data, would connect the dots. The key was plausible deniability. If questioned, I could always say I was just providing comprehensive historical context. My actions were professionally sound, even helpful. But the cumulative effect of these subtle disclosures was to create a growing sense of unease around David's candidacy. People on the vetting committee, naturally curious and diligent, started to dig deeper. They interviewed junior staff who had worked under David, people who, over the years, had also quietly fumed about his credit-taking. Encouraged by the new scrutiny, these individuals, who might have otherwise remained silent, cautiously began to voice their own observations, often framed as concerns about team morale or questions about historical intellectual property attribution. The psychological tension in the office became palpable. David, still radiating confidence, seemed oblivious to the subtle shift in atmosphere. He continued to prepare for his final interviews, his presentations polished to a blinding sheen. He was so consumed by his own narrative, so convinced of his invulnerability, that he failed to notice the cracks forming in the foundation of his fabricated success. He saw only the finish line, not the precipice just beyond it. One afternoon, I received an unexpected email. It was from Michael, the internal audit contact. The subject line was innocuous: follow up on our recent discussion. The body of the email was equally brief: Alex, could you please provide me with any detailed documentation you might have regarding the conceptualization and initial design phases of the Apex project, specifically focusing on the core architectural framework? We're conducting a comprehensive historical review as part of a larger internal initiative, and your insights would be invaluable. My heart pounded. This was it. My decade of patience, my meticulous documentation, my quiet vigilance, it was all coming to fruition. I replied immediately, attaching a carefully curated selection of files from my archive, a digital time capsule of truth. The trap was set. Now, all I had to do was wait for the spring to snap shut. The vindication I had so long craved was finally within reach. The email from Michael was the signal I had been waiting for, the quiet confirmation that my carefully laid groundwork was bearing fruit. My hands trembled slightly as I attached the files. Not just the Apex project documents, but also a summary of my decade-long observations, cross-referenced with other projects where David had employed similar tactics. It was a meticulously organized, irrefutable dossier, a silent accusation backed by years of evidence. I sent it, then leaned back in my chair, a strange mix of exhilaration and trepidation washing over me. The die was cast. The days that followed were a torturous blend of anticipation and forced normalcy. I continued my work, attending meetings, responding to emails, maintaining my professional demeanor. But beneath the surface, my mind was a whirlwind of what-ifs. What if they dismissed it? What if David, with his political cunning, managed to deflect the accusations? What if my efforts backfired, marking me as a troublemaker? The fear was real, a cold knot in my stomach. Yet, stronger than the fear was the unyielding belief in the truth and the conviction that David Thorne, after a decade of unearned success, deserved to face the consequences of his actions. The atmosphere at Viridian began to shift, subtly at first, then more perceptibly. The usual buzz of corporate gossip around David's impending promotion started to dwindle, replaced by a strange, almost palpable silence whenever his name was mentioned. His usual confident stride seemed to falter slightly. His once booming laugh was less frequent, less resonant. He still carried himself with an air of authority, but a faint shadow of unease seemed to cling to him. He started to look more tired, his eyes betraying a flicker of anxiety I had never seen before. It was as if the invisible threads of his carefully woven narrative were slowly, irrevocably unraveling. I heard through the grapevine that the CTO vetting process had been extended. Then, that it was undergoing additional layers of review. These were corporate euphemisms for trouble, red flags waving in the wind. Rumors began to circulate, vague at first, then more specific. Whispers about concerns regarding historical project attribution, about discrepancies in intellectual property claims, about anomalies in performance reviews. The names of various projects were mentioned, including, inevitably, the Apex project. The seeds I had planted years ago, the careful documentation, the subtle nudges, they were now blooming into a full-blown investigation. David, sensing the shift, became increasingly agitated. His charm, once effortless, now seemed strained. He started to make more frequent, unannounced visits to the offices of senior executives, his voice hushed, his demeanor anxious. He called more impromptu meetings with his direct reports, demanding updates, seemingly trying to reassert control over a narrative that was slipping through his fingers. He even tried to engage me in conversation once, a forced joviality in his tone. "Alex, how's that new AI integration project coming along? Always appreciate your meticulous eye for detail, you know." He paused, a forced smile on his face. "Just making sure everything's above board, right? No surprises." His eyes darted, searching, probing. I met his gaze calmly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching my lips. "Always, David," I replied, my voice even. "Always above board." The subtext hung heavy in the air between us. The vindication I had craved for so long was no longer a distant dream. It was taking shape, slowly, deliberately. The psychological shift within me was profound. The constant knot of resentment in my stomach began to loosen. The cynicism, while still present, was tempered by a growing sense of empowerment. I was no longer a victim. I was an agent of change, a quiet force for justice. The weight of the secret I had carried for a decade was beginning to lift, replaced by a quiet, fierce satisfaction. Then came the official announcement, delivered via a terse, carefully worded internal memo from the CEO's office. Subject: Update on CTO search. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened it. The first paragraph was a generic statement about the importance of the CTO role. The second paragraph contained the bombshell. After an exhaustive and comprehensive review process, the board of directors has decided to broaden the scope of its search for a chief technology officer. While Mr. David Thorne remains a valued member of the Viridian Dynamics leadership team, he will not be advancing to the final stage of consideration for this critical role at this time. Will not be advancing. The words were an exquisite symphony of justice. It wasn't a public shaming, not a dramatic firing, but it was a definitive, undeniable rejection, a public acknowledgement that his ascent had been halted. The CEO's memo was a masterpiece of corporate understatement, but its message was crystal clear to anyone who understood the intricate dance of power at Viridian. David Thorne had been found wanting. His carefully constructed empire had begun to crumble. And I, a quiet observer, a patient architect of truth, had played a pivotal role in its demise. The 10-year wait was over. The first taste of karma was sweet. The air in Viridian Dynamics, usually thick with the hum of ambition and the clatter of keyboards, felt suddenly lighter, almost breathable. David Thorne's public, albeit understated, rejection from the CTO role sent ripples throughout the organization. The carefully worded memo from the CEO was a masterclass in corporate diplomacy, but its underlying message was clear to everyone. David Thorne, the golden boy, had been quietly, decisively dethroned. The whispers intensified, no longer vague rumors but specific conjectures about ethical concerns and misattribution of work. The details, though not officially released, seemed to circulate through the grapevine with astonishing speed, fueled by years of suppressed frustrations from those who had witnessed his tactics firsthand. I watched David in the days following the announcement. The change in him was stark. The effortless swagger was gone, replaced by a subtle slump in his shoulders, a slight tremor in his hands when he held his coffee cup. His once impeccable suits seemed to hang a little looser, his polished veneer cracking under the immense pressure. He avoided eye contact, his gaze often fixed on some distant point, as if trying to disappear into the office landscape. The silence that now greeted him in hallways was deafening, a stark contrast to the deferential greetings he once commanded. He was still an executive vice president, still held a corner office, but the aura of invincibility that had surrounded him for a decade had vanished, replaced by the unmistakable scent of professional vulnerability. The psychological shift within me was profound. The constant tension in my shoulders began to ease. The knot in my stomach, a permanent fixture for years, finally started to unravel. It wasn't a triumphant roar of victory, but a quiet, deep sense of satisfaction, a profound vindication. I hadn't sought to destroy him, only to ensure that truth prevailed, that justice, however quiet, was served. And it had been. The years of meticulous documentation, the suppressed frustration, the long, arduous wait, it had all been worth it. The scales had begun to balance. My colleagues, Sarah and Mark, approached me cautiously. "Alex," Sarah began, her voice low, "the memo we heard. Is this because of what you did?" Mark nodded, his eyes searching mine. I simply smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached my eyes for the first time in years. I just provided some historical context, some detailed documentation, I said, my voice calm, almost serene. It seems the vetting committee decided to look a little deeper this time. They understood. Their own faces, once etched with a similar weariness, now held a glimmer of relief, a shared sense of justice. It was a silent acknowledgement of our collective ordeal and a quiet celebration of its resolution. The bond between us, forged in the crucible of shared injustice, felt stronger than ever. The internal audit department, led by Michael, continued its quiet work. The initial CTO vetting had merely opened the door. Now, with David's credibility fractured, other departments felt emboldened to bring forward their own concerns. Stories of missed deadlines, budget overruns quietly swept under the rug, and, inevitably, more instances of credit appropriation began to surface. David's carefully constructed house of cards, built on the foundations of others' labor, was beginning to collapse under its own fraudulent weight. The corporate machine, once so eager to promote David, now moved with a cold, impersonal efficiency to contain the damage. His responsibilities were gradually, subtly, reallocated. Key projects were reassigned to others. His presence in senior leadership meetings became less frequent, then almost non-existent. He was being systematically, quietly, sidelined. Viridian, ever mindful of its public image, wasn't going to fire him outright, not yet. That would draw too much attention, invite too many questions. Instead, they were slowly, methodically isolating him, stripping away his power and influence until he became a hollow shell of his former self. The psychological decline of David Thorne was evident. He became withdrawn, his once gregarious personality shrinking into itself. He stopped coming into the office as frequently, opting for remote work, a clear sign of his diminished status. When he did appear, he was a ghost, haunting the hallways he once strode through with such arrogance. He had lost not just a promotion, but his carefully constructed identity, his very reason for being in the corporate world. He was a man who had built his entire career on perception, and now that perception had been shattered. For me, the vindication was not about schadenfreude, not about reveling in his downfall. It was about restoration. It was about reclaiming my narrative, my professional integrity. The bitterness that had festered for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. I could now focus on my work with genuine passion, without the constant undercurrent of resentment. The burden had been lifted. The long game had been played, and I had won. It was a victory not just for me, but for the principle that true merit, eventually, finds its rightful place. The corporate karma had delivered its first, decisive blow. But the full arc of justice, I sensed, was still unfolding. This was just the beginning of the end for David Thorne. The quiet unraveling of David Thorne's career continued with an almost poetic inevitability. The initial rejection from the CTO role was merely the first domino. Once the internal audit department, spurred by my documentation and the subsequent corroborating whispers, began their deeper dive, the extent of David's fabrications became undeniable. It wasn't just about the Apex project anymore. It was a systemic pattern of intellectual property appropriation, inflated self-assessments, and a consistent failure to acknowledge the contributions of his teams. The narrative of his genius that Viridian had so eagerly embraced for a decade was slowly, painstakingly dismantled. His responsibilities were systematically stripped away, one by one. The key client accounts he once managed were reassigned. His direct reports were moved to other departments, leaving him with a skeleton crew and projects of diminishing importance. The once bustling wing of his office became eerily quiet, his nameplate a stark reminder of a fading empire. He was no longer invited to executive meetings, his input no longer sought. He existed in a corporate purgatory, a high-ranking title with no real power, a ghost in the machine he once so confidently manipulated. The psychological impact on David was devastating. He had built his entire identity around his professional success, around the perception of his brilliance. With that perception shattered, he seemed to lose his very moorings. He became increasingly isolated, his phone calls less frequent, his emails unanswered. The man who once thrived on being the center of attention now actively avoided it. I occasionally saw him in the hallways, a gaunt, haunted figure, his eyes hollow. He never met my gaze, always looking away, as if unable to bear the silent accusation he knew was there. The sheer weight of his deceit, now exposed, seemed to crush him. He was experiencing his own, very personal corporate karma, a slow, agonizing descent into irrelevance. For me, the sense of vindication grew, but it was tempered by a surprising lack of malice. There was no joy in seeing him suffer, only a quiet satisfaction that justice had prevailed. The bitterness that had poisoned my professional life for so long had finally receded, leaving behind a clear, unburdened mind. I found myself focusing on my work with renewed vigor, my passion for innovation reignited. My contributions were now undeniably mine, recognized and valued for their true merit. My reputation within Viridian, already solid, only strengthened. I was seen as someone with integrity, someone who had quietly weathered a storm and emerged stronger. The firm, in its characteristic pursuit of efficiency, eventually reached an amicable solution with David. It wasn't a public firing. Viridian preferred to avoid such messy spectacles. Instead, a company-wide email announced his departure to pursue other opportunities, a polite euphemism for a forced exit. He was given a generous severance package, a final, cynical transaction to ensure his silence and prevent any potential legal complications. It was the corporate way of sweeping a scandal under the rug, of preserving the illusion of a harmonious workplace. But the silence from David, the man who had once been a ubiquitous presence in the corporate landscape, was deafening. He didn't issue a statement, didn't appear at any industry events. He simply vanished from the professional world, swallowed by the very system he had so skillfully exploited. It was a stark reminder that while the corporate world might protect its image, it ultimately discards those who threaten its carefully constructed narratives. Life at Viridian, post-David, felt different. A subtle but significant shift had occurred. Senior leadership, having witnessed the fallout of unchecked ambition and fabricated success, seemed to place a greater emphasis on genuine contribution and ethical conduct. There were new initiatives to recognize individual achievements, more transparent processes for project credit. It was a small but meaningful change, a testament to the power of truth, even when it takes a decade to surface. My own career continued its upward trajectory, now unburdened by the weight of past injustice. I was promoted to Director of Advanced Analytics, a role that allowed me to lead innovative projects and mentor junior talent, ensuring they received the recognition they deserved. I made it a point to foster a culture of transparency and respect within my teams, a direct counterpoint to the environment David Thorne had cultivated. I became an advocate for ethical leadership, often sharing, subtly, the lessons learned from my own experiences, without ever naming names. The final, satisfying sense of vindication came not from David's demise, but from my own resurgence. It was the knowledge that I had not allowed his actions to define me, to poison my spirit. I had persevered, held onto my integrity, and ultimately, carved out a path based on genuine merit. The corporate karma had not just brought David Thorne down. It had lifted me up, stronger and wiser than before. The decade-long ordeal had been painful, but it had also been transformative. It had taught me invaluable lessons about resilience, patience, and the enduring power of truth. The story of corporate karma wasn't just about what David Thorne lost. It was about what I, Alex, had ultimately gained. The final chapter, I knew, was still to be written, but the core lesson had been learned. The corporate landscape, post-David Thorne, felt like a forest after a wildfire. The scorched earth remained, a testament to what had been, but new growth was already beginning to emerge, stronger and more resilient. Viridian Dynamics, in its relentless pursuit of efficiency and public image, quickly moved to fill the void left by David's departure. The CTO role, after an even more rigorous search, was filled by an external hire, a woman known for her deep technical expertise and unimpeachable integrity. Her appointment sent a clear message. Viridian was serious about its commitment to genuine innovation, not just perceived success. My new role as Director of Advanced Analytics was both a challenge and a privilege. I was now in a position of significant influence, overseeing critical strategic initiatives and leading a large, talented team. I made it my personal mission to cultivate an environment where creativity flourished, where every contribution was recognized, and where credit was meticulously attributed. I implemented new processes for project tracking, for peer reviews, and for public recognition, all designed to prevent another David Thorne from ever taking root. I spoke openly, though without naming specific individuals, about the importance of integrity, transparency, and collaborative spirit. My team responded with enthusiasm, thriving in an atmosphere of trust and mutual respect. The psychological scars of the past decade began to truly heal. The constant vigilance, the underlying current of resentment, slowly faded into memory. I found myself genuinely enjoying my work again, the intellectual challenge of complex problems, the satisfaction of building something truly impactful. My relationships with Sarah and Mark deepened. We were no longer just colleagues. We were survivors, bound by a shared history and a mutual respect. They had also thrived in the new environment, their talents finally fully recognized. Sarah was promoted to lead data scientist, and Mark became a senior software architect. We often met for coffee, no longer to commiserate, but to brainstorm, to celebrate successes, and to reflect on the lessons learned. One quiet afternoon, almost a year after David's departure, I received an unexpected email. It was from a former Viridian colleague who had left the firm years ago and now worked at a smaller tech startup. The subject line was intriguing. "You won't believe this." The email contained a link to a news article from a regional business journal. My heart gave a strange lurch as I clicked on it. The headline screamed, "Tech Startup Innovate X Files for Bankruptcy Amidst Allegations of Financial Mismanagement and Misleading Investor Claims." And the accompanying photo, stark and unflattering, was unmistakably David Thorne. The article detailed how David, after leaving Viridian, had quickly joined a fledgling tech startup as its CEO, leveraging his Viridian title and his fabricated reputation as a visionary leader. He had secured significant venture capital funding, promising revolutionary AI products and unprecedented market disruption. However, the article alleged, the company's technology was largely vaporware, its financial projections wildly inflated, and its innovative products were, in essence, rehashed versions of existing open-source solutions, with little true intellectual property. The article hinted at internal whistleblowers and a looming SEC investigation. It was a spectacular, very public implosion. A cold, almost clinical sense of vindication washed over me. This wasn't the quiet corporate sidelining. This was a full-blown public disgrace. David Thorne, the master of perception, had finally been exposed on a grand scale. He had tried to replicate his Viridian success in a less forgiving environment, without the protective shield of a large corporation, and his fraudulent methods had been laid bare for the entire world to see. He had stolen credit, then tried to build an entire company on a foundation of lies, and it had all come crashing down. The article mentioned that the investors had lost millions. Employees were laid off without notice. The company's reputation was in tatters. David Thorne, the visionary, was now a pariah, his name irrevocably linked to failure and alleged fraud. The irony was palpable. He had built his career by taking credit, by claiming others' work as his own. Now, the very act of claiming what wasn't his on a much larger, more public scale, had led to his ultimate downfall. I closed the article, a deep, satisfying sigh escaping my lips. This was the true corporate karma. Not just the quiet professional decline, but a complete and utter public humiliation, a financial ruin that would likely follow him for the rest of his life. He had lost everything: his reputation, his wealth, his professional standing. The universe, in its own slow, deliberate way, had balanced the scales. The decade-long wait, the silent suffering, the meticulous documentation, it had all culminated in this moment. The vindication was complete, profound, and utterly deserved. This was the final, devastating chapter of David Thorne's story. My story, however, was just beginning, unburdened and truly free.